Mixa, welcome to the Simpleton Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Clark. Glad to be here.
Before I introduce your title and your role and everything, could you tell me what the last name Mixa, where that comes from?
Oh, yeah. Well, I've had to rethink that, or I've explored that recently, and I think it actually comes ultimately from the city of Breslau, which is Wrocław in Poland today. But I think the name has a Silesian. Have you ever heard of the Silesian Germans? So it's a German last name. But today you'll find a bunch of Mixas in Munich and Vienna. In fact, one of the bishops, there was a bishop from Germany named Bishop Mixa, but he he had to resign for kind of a scandal.
Oh no.
Yeah, nothing really. It was bad, but not what you think. But he's a good friend of Pope Benedict. So yeah, okay. Mixa. So if you type in Mixa, you'll find him.
So Robert, you are the educational fellow.
Yes.
With the Word on Fire Institute. And I'm interested in talking to you about two things. I want to talk to you about Catholic education, but I also want to talk to you about Word on Fire, because as I understand it, were you one of the first employees?
I think so. I don't have proof of that, but typically there's another employee named Roseanne Lee who came in October, but I guess I was there in June. But so yeah, I guess I'm the first. I remember meeting Bishop Barron, then Father Barron, with Father Steve Grunow, right after I graduated. But that was so I would say I'm one of the first, I guess, the original gangster.
What is the give people a sense, what is the era? Were you guys at Mundelein, and what year was it when you started? And what was the first projects of Word on Fire?
Yeah. So when I came on, Bishop Barron actually needed help. He needed help with some of his research for his academic pursuits. But they also were working on this thing called, that eventually became known as the Catholicism series. So when I met Bishop Barron, they just got an office in Skokie, Illinois. And Bishop Barron was still teaching at the seminary full time. And he'd come to the office every now and then. But a lot of their meetings before that office were at Panera Bread. And so Word on Fire started, it was the official name when Bishop Barron was recording his homilies for WGN, which was the major local radio station. And I think he had a time slot at 5 a.m. on Sundays. And but eventually he got involved in YouTube. So he started doing that, I think around 2007, 2008. I met him as an undergrad when he was giving a talk at Xavier University on the south side of Chicago. And that's when I was a senior, and I was talking to him, and he said, shoot me an email. And so I did. And then he got me in touch with Father Steve. And right when I was done at St. Louis University, Father Steve said, come up to Mundelein Seminary. That's where I met Bishop Barron.
So
again,
it's been a dozen years or 15 years. Is that about the time frame?
Yeah, but it's kind of been on and off for me. I went up in the meantime, I went up to DC, then I worked for him at Mundelein Seminary, and then I taught at the high school literally across the street from Mundelein Seminary for a number of years. And then now I'm here in Dallas working for the Institute.
Now, how many employees are there today? How big is Word on Fire right now?
Oh my gosh, I can't even, I would say probably around mid 50s. There's probably around 50. There could even be 60. I'm not even sure. It seems yeah.
The part I'm familiar with, which is what I think most people are familiar with, is maybe some books, Bishop Barron on YouTube, Bishop Barron interacting with, different people in the culture, right? What other projects does Word and Fire do that maybe we don't know about?
Yeah. That's kind of what the Institute's trying to work on. So yeah, typically for now, a lot of the stuff is primarily focused on Bishop Barron, but we have these other YouTube shows and series that are coming out. You've seen probably maybe Meet the Bullmans. Andrew Petiprin, one of my colleagues, has a show called Watch With Me, in which he walks through kind of the theological themes of different movies. We also have some other documentaries set up that will be coming out soon. I can't say the names, but we also have a bunch of. We're going to be planning a lot of in-person events eventually here in Dallas. When I came here, COVID hit, and so we had all these plans for in-person events, and we had to put those on hold. So we hope to get those things going again. And
what is your main work for the Institute?
So, I'm the education fellow. So initially, I was kind of putting together a lot of the curriculum and study guides for the courses that the Institute offers. The Word on Fire Institute has, I don't know how many courses, probably in the 20s, but we have courses on just different topics. And so I started doing that, but I was really convinced that we need something primarily for just educators and influencing Catholic schools with a certain kind of, I don't want to call it a Word on Fire approach, but what I thought was taking Bishop Barron's insights on Catholic education and then really helping educators implement that within their schools. So right now we're coming out, keeps getting pushed back, but hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have this thing within the Word on Fire Institute called the education pathway. We'll have numerous pathways, but within that pathway, we'll have content specifically for educators. So it's kind of like teaching the teachers on the kind of basics of this theological approach and the difference that makes for a new Catholic education.
I want to talk a little bit more about Word on Fire, because I find the Institute kind of fascinating. And one of the reasons I find it fascinating is that I feel like I hear some people critique Word on Fire, and I don't think their critiques are ever very good. And part of the reason is it's this may not be your cup of tea, but who else is doing this work? You know, why do you feel like my sense is there should be 10 more Word on Fires? Not doing exactly what you guys do, but having their own kind of, flavor. Do you feel like there's room for that? Because I just feel like, Bishop Barron seems almost like a lone voice on the internet, interacting with important people of our age. It would be like watching him interact with Jordan Peterson, per se, right? Why don't we have more people engaging, a Ben Shapiro or leaders of Black Lives Matter and just entering into these conversations publicly,
Well, I mean, Bishop Barron's unique in the sense that he has a charm and also the knowledge, and background to effectively engage them. Sometimes you find a lot of people who are so eager to get involved, but they don't have the intellectual formation to do that well. So I think I totally agree with you. We need as many people as possible engaging people, just as Bishop Barron does. But we also need to provide, ways of effectively doing that. So we need to really emphasize, get people having programs like philosophy programs, theology programs that are perhaps, that are academic and scholarly, but also for the sake of actually engaging the culture as well, training people to do that.
So I
that's what the Word on Fire Institute's hopefully trying to do.
Okay. I feel like there's two interesting things that come out of what you said. One is kind of scary. It sounds like you're saying that amongst the bishops and amongst the scholars in the Catholic Church, of which we have a ton, there just isn't enough talent to be interacting with the culture.
Well, I mean, okay, I don't want to accuse people, but I think that sometimes you have people who know an awful lot. But in some ways, the personality isn't suited to having effective conversations, or even giving, say, lectures that are dynamic and not boring. Bishop Barron, I think, is like the best homilist. I don't want to praise Bishop Barron too much. He gets enough praise. But I think that he's able to engage people really well. And he draws from his philosophy background. He has a good literary background. If you read his books, he's not just doing philosophy or theology, but he does everything in a very unique way where he really, in some ways, captivates the whole person. And his homilies are just excellent. He really opens up scriptures, and he uses contemporary language to do that without dumbing it down, without, in some ways, like going off the rails and not staying true to what the scriptures are about themselves. But he knows how to open things up well. And part of that is because, he studied at a young age, Paul Tillich and a number of others, theologians who he doesn't agree with ultimately, who knew how to do that, who were trying to find a language to really not make relevant, because, he doesn't want to do that necessarily, but he does make it relevant while at the same time remaining true to the substance of the material itself.
So I agree with what you're saying. And my wife the other day was listening to Bishop Barron in the kitchen, and she turns around to me and she says, and my wife's a smart lady. She has a philosophy degree and everything. She goes, "We are lucky to live in a time that Bishop Barron is active." Yeah. I was like, whoa, are you overstating that? And I was like, maybe you're right. I don't know. But how does he have someone? So to me, what's more interesting about him than just giving the good homilies in a way that's maybe relevant, but he also seems to have a finger on the pulse of culture.
Yeah.
Right. And does someone help him with that? Like, do you guys have young, hip people at Word on Fire?
Young, hip people.
On who the new, person he needs to interact with is? Or is Bishop Barron like sitting up at night watching other people's YouTube videos and staying abreast of the young, hip stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Bishop Barron asks for advice, and, he's constantly, saying, well, who should I be paying attention to? And like, what's going on in this area here and all that. So yeah, he definitely gets like a ton of help, but I think, his whole approach, he oftentimes talks about the logos spermaticoi, right? And he has, I don't want to call it like a positive approach, but he sees, right, the logos in everything. And so he tries to start there with where actually he sees the logos, and then connect the logos spermaticoi to the logos itself. And he's not afraid to talk to anyone. And he doesn't wag his finger at the culture, but he tries to take that, if you want to say, the hunger or the restlessness of the human heart, and then connect that ultimately to what we're all desiring. So
one of the other things you said a minute ago was the need for theology programs to be forming people so that they could engage culture.
Yeah.
And I have been a little bit of a war against theology programs. And it's not that I'm against theology. I think everybody should know as much theology as they possibly can. But I feel like we have, if anything, too many theology programs that are inward focused, meaning like they're very interested in maybe a dispute with Thomas Aquinas or with Augustine or with this thing they're working out, right? But they're not like turning themselves towards the nihilism in the culture and like asking, how do we present Jesus here? Or I guess I want them to have more of a engagement edge or a evangelical edge.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm kind of against having more programs. I just want the programs that there are, because if anything, I feel like we're getting lots of theology PhDs who aren't doing engagement, and there aren't even enough jobs for them.
Yeah, I totally agree. That, like, when I wanted to go study theology, it's really hard to find a program that does that. And I don't want to say engages the culture. Like that's, the ultimate end itself. Because, you should have a program that really is doing theology, per se. But I think that oftentimes the academy, it can become like a little bit of an echo chamber. They're continuing to throw, and you need these academic conferences. But I mean, they may have a conference just on how Thomas Aquinas interprets, like, say, essay. And that's really good, but you need to find people who kind of can show, well, why is Thomas Aquinas's reading of that so important? And Bishop Barron does that oftentimes when he's engaging the atheists, and how he talks about God, and he can draw from Thomas Aquinas to do that well. But very often too, you have people who aren't trained to do that well, and so they know an awful lot of the works of Thomas Aquinas. They've mastered his lingo, but when they meet somebody who doesn't speak that way, and you don't have enough time to fully induct them into Thomas's system, you need to have people who are trained to be able to relate to them well, and then take the language that they're using and then show how that actually makes most sense within the Catholic thing, so to speak.
Well, the other point I want to push back on here, and this might just be the Clark Massey axe he grinds or what, but like I heard recently that there was this, that one of the attitudes in the Orthodox Church is that when you get too far into theology, you only get one good idea for each two bad ideas. And what I see when the way that rings true to me is I see young people who want to know God better. They want to deepen their relationship with God, and therefore they go into theology, right? As opposed to into like relationship or spirituality or things like this, right? And I think sometimes with this theology stuff, you're not getting relationship in the same proportion you're getting academic rigor and theology. And I think that directly influences our evangelization.
Yeah.
Like how do we make the good news more real to the world? How do we help people enter a relationship with God in a very healthy, beautiful way? And maybe it's not by being encyclopedic.
Yeah.
In your theological knowledge, but certainly there has to be theological knowledge.
Yeah.
Right. So I do feel like there's this sense in which I want theology programs to ask, what's the cash value?
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd be able to engage the culture, if you know what the cash value is of some of these ideas,
Yeah. I mean, Hans von Balthasar was really critical of the theology that he was exposed to in the seminary. And he has a really good essay on bringing together theology and spirituality, because in his day, you find theology just kind of was becoming its own thing, totally detached from spirituality. Spirituality was losing its connection to theology. And so his whole goal was to show how the two are basically the same thing. And Bishop Barron's totally in that tradition. If you read one of his first books, which is actually, I think, a condensed version of his dissertation, it's called Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master. He shows the spiritual implications of Thomas Aquinas's theology. And that was, Bishop Barron's totally in line what Hans von Balthasar was calling for in that essay, written perhaps I think in the 1950s. But everything's kind of a piece. And I agree. What is the cash value of having so many theology programs out there in which what is it bringing to the church?
Well, let's talk about your education projects. What is your big mission with Catholic education?
Okay, so maybe I got to explain my my insights from working in Catholic education for a little bit. I used to teach at a Catholic high school, and everybody was great at the school, but I thought it was lacking kind of the unique Catholic educational vision. So I think that would, once people would see that, and you need somebody there to kind of articulate that for them, it would make sense. Why does the church even have schools in the first place? And so part of my mission here is to basically provide that vision, to teach people the vision of Catholic education, if you want to call that a theological vision, which then makes sense of all of the disciplines. So there would be kind of a hierarchical ordering in which everything will find their center in Christ, the Logos incarnate. And so I think that's such a treasure that the church has. The church has kind of worked that out, but so many people within Catholic schools, teachers themselves, have never come to know that vision.
Do you have a program of action for that? Like, I see a lot of people now, like introducing classical curriculums, founding new schools, things like this, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, my basic mission, we were talking about this a little bit before the recording, but my mission is to popularize Stratford Caldecott, who was a British, I wouldn't call him a theologian, philosopher. Caldecott was his own thing. But Caldecott wrote 2 books around the time I started working for Word on Fire and getting interested in education. I mean, I was always asking the question.
What are the names of these 2 books?
Yeah, these 2 books. The first one that came out was called Beauty for Truth's Sake, okay, on the re-enchantment of education. And the second one is called Beauty in the Word, Rethinking the Foundations of Education.
I like the way you showed this to us. They don't look like overly long books.
No, yeah, they're kind of like manifestos, which basically, I mean, Caldecott died, I think, in 2014. And it's basically, I see, perhaps, I don't know if he had cancer when he wrote these books, but I see it's like he basically just put out these, if you call them like almost brochures, to inspire other people to carry like this vision forward for him. So to flesh things out a little bit more. But if you look at the bibliographies in the back of these books, I mean, he really provides these great resources that I think will help do just what he calls for in the first book, re-enchant education. So, I mean, he takes this approach in which like the Logos is central. And the beauty, okay, the way we come to first know and experience the Logos is through beauty. He takes a very Balthasarian approach, which is also kind of a Bishop Barron approach. And then he applies that to education. And so unlike some of these classical programs, he puts a strong emphasis on wonder. Sometimes, I mean, I'm not an expert in classical education, but from what I've seen is sometimes you have people saying, okay, well, we need to put kids through this rigorous liberal arts program, okay, give them Thomas Aquinas at a young age, catechize them well, and do all these things, just check off all these boxes. But yet you have kids who've never actually had this kind of experience of wonder, which you can't, by the way, you can't.
Which the language you're using reminds me a lot of the language I hear in Montessori settings. Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of people who are inspired by Caldecott actually go on to teach at Montessori schools. Anyways, Caldecott for me is he like Bishop Barron is not afraid to draw from all these things that are just good, true, and beautiful, right? And then he connects it to, not in a artificial way or forced way, but he connects it to it finding its fullness in Christ. And so
let me just try to understand it concretely in a sense, right? If we're going to talk about World War II,
yeah,
How do we educate kids about World War II and keep the logos at the center?
Well, I would say that primarily, I mean, what's interesting, if you look at a book by a guy named, what's his name? He's out, Alan Jacobs. He wrote a book called 1943, the year of our Lord, 1943. And the whole book is just on education. And it's all when World War II is happening. But at that time, all of these scholars gathered together, like T.S. Eliot, Jacques Maritain, W.H. Auden, Charles, what's his name? Christopher Dawson. And they all saw World War II as, okay, yes, it has all these political causes that brought it about, but they saw it primarily as a distortion in education. So what went into the formative vision? What was the formative vision into which all of these nations, these peoples, were being educated into, which they thought as the deepest cause of World War II? And so what they wanted to do was they said, we need to rethink education in order to, because they knew at that time that the Allies were likely going to win, right? And so they thought, well, what we need to do is we really need to implement a very, very robust education that has its source in the Christian tradition. So you'll find Jacques Maritain has a great book called Education at the Crossroads that he wrote around this time. Christopher Dawson, I think, has a book called The Crisis of Education. So if I was teaching World War II, I would look at how was Stalin educated? How was Hitler educated?
Do you mean how they were educated, or what was their worldview?
Their worldview, which, by the way, I think you can look at all, and not necessarily what they were getting in the schools, but what were the ideas that, like worldview that was shaping them, that also took a hold of I mean, that if you look at Prussian education, for example, you could say Hegel had a pretty big influence in that. And so that would make someone think that, which also Hegel has an influence on, say, the Soviet Union. Karl Marx studied Hegel. Well, what is that all about? You could think, oh, well, it's about imitating the eschaton. People thinking that through legitimating violence to bring about a certain where history is going. Okay. And so it's a certain distortion of the Christian worldview. And you could say that maybe that was secularized, but that was being implemented not only in the schools, but in the whole ethos into which they are being formed. And so I think that would be one really interesting approach to how to approach World War II. It's funny you bring up World War II. I'm listening to a book right now called Black Earth. My wife's from Poland, so I'm always interested in like the history of that region. And now with the war in Ukraine, I'm listening to a guy. I don't agree with everything he says, but a guy named Timothy Snyder, and he does a really good job in this book and a bunch of others getting into if you want to say, the formation of these key individuals.
So it is funny that I brought up World War II because it appeared that you were locked and loaded, ready for that topic. I was thinking this will be a hard topic to put Christ at the center of. But so I feel like what you're saying, though, is all the human events in history come back to human formation. And if we so it's like you're studying education as education in a sense, meaning like when you teach about history, you're going to also be teaching these kids how historically people were educated, right? And then what results that had, I suppose, right?
I mean, can I draw one other person I really
sure.
There's a guy named Werner Jaeger who wrote trilogy called Paideia. It's on Greek. It's mainly on Greek education or Greek formation, but he sees it primarily as every single education has an ideal into which, okay, a formative ideal, if you want to say. And so a certain understanding of excellence, human excellence, you can't escape that. Even if it's just a purely technocratic education, there's some moral ideal into which they're being educated. So a lot of parents, for example, will send their kids to some schools thinking that, hey, this school will actually make my kid into someone like Elon Musk. Or so what is that ideal? And so what he does is he walks through all, starting with kind of Homeric Greek culture. You have Achilles as a certain ideal, a warrior, hero kind of ideal. Then you have Odysseus, kind of a practical one, Socrates, and then in Christian education, Christ. And so I think trying to get people to think about that is really, really important, because all education presupposes a certain ultimate human end into what are we being shaped for?
All right. So what's kind of difficult about the conversation is I think we're blurring education about history and history of education, which I'm wondering if you're actually saying that's the same thing. So that like if you get a Caldecott style education, if you live this manifesto he wrote, right?
Yeah.
Then when you study history, you'll say, when was Christ the ideal? When was there a separate ideal than Christ? How do we understand that? And then all that kind of explains the unfolding of history.
Yeah.
That's the way you make it Christ-centered, I suppose. Right. So this seems different than like part of, there's definitely like a sincere desire amongst Catholics and even amongst non-Catholics, Christians in general, and even just say people of men and women of goodwill, as the papal encyclicals are addressed, to change education, and sometimes they're kind of grasping at these ideas of like, let's educate them in the Western tradition. Right. And I don't hear you saying that. Right. And I often see these attempts as like, some of them get really silly. Right. Like I've had people who told me that the Greeks understood all math. There's no point in studying math after the Greeks. I've seen, homeschool curriculums that like are teaching Roman math, or somebody like recently I went to something that was really good, but it's really hard to explain what they're going for. And so they'll start talking about like tradition is the point, like tradition as a goal within itself, which is a weird goal. Right.
Yeah.
And even the Western tradition, like when they say, well, we want to educate people with the great, well, one of the reasons why tradition's a weird goal is because they're talking about reading the greats, like a great books type approach. All of the greats were transgressive. They're like if you don't understand the greats as radical, you're not really reading the greats. And tradition is kind of like the staid, like they're being radical compared to tradition in a sense and helping us move forward in a way, right?
Yeah.
But then there's also this weird thing that like Karl Marx is part of the Western tradition.
Yeah.
It's a very important part of the Western tradition. And we know, and I know that most of these people want nothing to do with that guy, or at least they don't want to like give their kids that type of education, which I agree with, but it gets weird, I guess, when you try to like walk people through this.
Yeah. I mean, I'm kind of a little bit, I'm still trying to kind of like get a feeling for all of these different ways of approaching education. And to be honest, some of the stuff I find to be quite weird. But I mean, I'm coming out of a Jesuit school. So very often when people see my educational background, they will get a little confused because I'm not coming out of the typical program that will really take that great books approach. And you're right to say that those books at the time like were quite transgressive. But like, why are they called great in the first place? And Karl Marx, I mean, to be honest with you, if I had to set up a school, we would probably be reading tons of Karl Marx, not just to critique him, but I mean, to sympathize with what he was getting at and to see, well, what did he see? And I mean, to be honest, he probably has more of an influence on our culture than anyone else. And so in order to actually like know the world that you're in, even if you think you're totally outside of this, and I think some of the classical schools people can think that they're not in this, they're not in the world in which we are in. And even their way of approaching tradition and all this other stuff is actually kind of strange. It's not the same way that perhaps even Thomas Aquinas, who is like their hero, would approach it. But there's still, in some ways, within this worldview that was very much shaped by somebody like Karl Marx, as much as they tried to resist that. So what I'm calling for is not to like either, it's not to like shun classical approach. I think they're getting at something that's really important. And nor is it to kind of capitulate to the typical secular way of educating with a religion class tacked on. But I'm really calling for like a really integrated Catholic according to the whole. It's the word,
Well, the way you said that, and I kind of don't know that you mean what I took you to mean, the way you said that, it almost sounds like you're looking for the middle way between classical and the current approach. And
you could call it that, but I think it transcends that.
Yeah. I feel like classical, in a sense, is they know something's wrong. They know they need a solution. They know the solution's in a lot of the great books somehow, somewhere, somehow it's there. And which is I think still a Jesuit approach. I think honestly, they're kind of looking at a 19th century Jesuit education as the ideal.
Yeah.
Like it's a funny name, classical, because they're not actually talking about Roman, and they're not even talking about Middle Ages. They're actually talking about when Jesuits started founding schools and using, really changing things, But it gets weird so quick. It's like you make when you're trying to invent something new, you make a lot of errors,
Mm-hmm.
But I do have a question related to this about reform versus refound.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This question came to me first in the late 90s when I was looking around, and there were efforts like to reform Georgetown, wanting to make it more Catholic, and then Steubenville was kind of a big player at that moment of having a place that had kind of reformed, right? And it struck, and then there were also these new colleges being founded, like a Christendom or a TAC or a Ave Maria or something like this, right? And it struck me that places like Georgetown can never reform, and my reason is because there's too much money. And meaning like there's too many valuable professorships. There's too many people who want what is there and are like going to fight for it. There's a bunch of stakeholders there that are not Catholic who are willing to really fight for what they have, who are going to defeat a reform, right? But if you get a college essentially that's like a third tier failing Catholic college, and then you could reform it because kind of no one wants it anyway. Mm-hmm. Or you can just refound, right? But like it's clear now that like Steubenville is so much better off than they were in the 70s.
Yeah.
Like there's people who would turn down jobs at prestigious, research institutions to go teach at Steubenville, whereas in the 70s they were on a track to either close or no one was ever going to choose that place over a research institution. Mm. You know what I mean? So I see this now, like even in this Catholic school stuff that's going on around me, is that like we have like old prestigious high schools, and I don't see how they're ever going to turn around.
Yeah.
And then I think the people who are refounding it makes sense either. And I also see even amongst our elementary schools that there's like there was a failing elementary school in our area that adopted classical education and is reinvigorated somewhat, you know what I mean? But I don't know that you're going to go to one of the prestigious, successful elementary schools in our area and convince them to change curriculum.
Yeah.
As someone who's working on this, what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's why I think we need to create a network with these schools that are capable of turning around. I don't see it necessarily. I don't see my audience as primarily being those prestigious, wealthy schools. I think they'll continue to exist, but there's just too much of a battle to make much of a difference.
And I don't know that they're net negatives. Like, I think the question is still out on that. In a sense, like I lived in a city that has a failing public school district. So Catholic schools in the failing public school district have remained strong for decades because they are the alternative to the failing public schools, right? And they're serving a real purpose, right? Are they all like very, alive in the faith? I don't know. I suspect they're not. I wish they were more alive in the faith, right?
And it's really hard to have I know a bunch of really Catholic administrators, and it's at some of these schools, and it's really hard to actually turn things around because of all the, like you said, all of the pressure,
the vested interests that are really encamped already, right?
Yeah,
and therefore, this energy to found new ones is, I think, good. I've told this story before on our podcast that at the very beginning of our ministry, when you were at the JP2 Institute, did you ever hear of a woman named Susan Shaughnessy? She had passed.
Yes, because they had the award under her name.
Yes, she was a good friend of mine.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and she and I were we were leaders of this ministry that had been around, at least 20 years, maybe 30. It was closing up, but it was a very radical ministry. It was a very good ministry. It's called Exodus Youth Services. And it was this awesome thing where we do Bible studies in the basements of public housing after dark. It was like a crazy, like something that you can't convince people to do type thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was on its way to closing its doors. There was just no way around it, right? And at the time, I was really distraught. And she was too. It was like, how do you let something like this die? Right? And it was like, the only reason you let something like this die is if you're founding new things.
Mm-hmm.
We always, and Simple House is the new thing that, in a sense, came out of Exodus, Why did I bring that up? But there's a sense in which, I feel like these new foundations of Catholic schools don't need to see themselves as anti the existing Catholic schools.
I agree.
I think that's a very that's defining yourself in the negative, right? And those Catholic schools might honestly be a net good. That's kind of in God's eyes on that one, but you can usually point to a need they're fulfilling,
Yeah. There's a great book. I think, what was it? I remember Alistair McIntyre when he gave this address at years ago at Notre Dame. I have the book here. It's something on classroom and community. But what Catholics, there was a study, I think it came out of University of Chicago Press, but they just showed how Catholic schools provided such a community, even to the neighborhood, that the public schools were never capable of providing. And so, leave aside where they were with staying faithful to the Catholic identity of the place, it at least created a community that really did bring about a certain good for that whole neighborhood. Crime rates were even down. Catholic schools does make a huge difference. Even the ones who've completely abandoned maybe the Catholic part.
That's great. If I know that there are people listening to this podcast who are part of these initiatives to found new schools or homeschooling because they find they want something better for their kid educationally, right? Do you have any? So I love that you gave this Caldecott recommendation, right? Is there anything at Word on Fire or something else that if people want to kind of get more of your perspective, on this, that they should look into?
Yeah. So, it should be coming out, I think maybe in October. We're doing a lot on Vatican II. When I first came in, I thought, well, a lot of Catholic schools, they'll kind of claim that they're a Vatican II school. And Bishop Barron at the time was doing a ton of stuff on Vatican II. And so I just was trying to, I mean, we've got like Richard DeClue working on Vatican II as well, but from kind of a Catholic schools perspective, I was trying to open up some of the constitutions for them to have this, like, what was the council going for, and articulating that, and then also the vision and its implementation by John Paul II, Benedict, and Pope Francis, and how to bring that rich vision of Vatican II to the schools, even though because they're all trying to say we're the Vatican II schools. So that program should be coming out probably like in October within the Word on Fire Institute. But then with these within this pathway, I'm working on a kind of theological anthropology 101 for educators. And so that's what I'm starting with. It's a 9-course series by which, we'll be looking at kind of like Gaudium et Spes 22, and then opening up like that for how do we think about things like the virtues, and why every teacher actually is part of this formative goal, this formative thing. Okay. That's another thing. I'm also working on, hold on one second. Do you mind if I grab this?
Sure.
I've got the book right here. I'm kind of drawing from some of these classic books that really influenced me. I don't really care for the cover, but The Art of Teaching by Gilbert Hyatt. I don't know if you've ever heard of Gilbert Hyatt. He's a classicist who translated all of these. Hold on. He translated all of these books by that Werner Jaeger.
You need to say the name of these for people who are just listening.
Yeah. So Werner Jaeger. Okay. He wrote this trilogy, okay, called the Ideals of Greek Culture, but it's really looking at the kind of education, not trying to say we need to go back to Greece, but I think there's a certain way of thinking that is really important. But going back to this book, I'm doing a course on this. So
on The Art of Teaching by Gilbert. How do you say his last name?
Gilbert Hyatt.
Highet.
To show too that like education isn't okay. I got to be careful how I say this.
No, you don't. I have this problem that we get experts on, and they're worried about offending people in their own field who are like hyped up on things. And it's like, we commoners, we just need to know the zingers and we need to know the truth.
Okay. So here, I'll full disclosure. When I was teaching, I was like the vice principal's nightmare. She was the one to make sure that everybody was like following the latest trends in the educational world. Right. Okay. And so we had 70-minute class periods. And I noticed I started teaching the way that really compelled me when I was a student. I mean, like I wanted to imitate the best teachers that I had. And they must have, I mean, I don't know if they even had a background in education, but they were doing something right. Okay. And so she told me that I need to have 10-minute like class lectures, only 10 minutes. I can't go beyond 10 minutes of actually, I don't want to like just give them information. I didn't think I was just giving them information, but that's how they put it. And then 60-minute class activities. Now, I could tell the students were even frustrated with that. And if we had a very engaging lecture, okay, in which there are certain things that I had passion for the subject, I knew the subject well, I understood my students and their interests, and I knew how to make analogies based on the things that they found that really important. And I also took the worldview that they had, okay, and in some ways, like, I don't want to say deconstructed it, but so that then they see the relevance of what I was trying to communicate to them. And I did that perhaps for the half of the semester to get at kind of the substance that I really wanted to really communicate. But anyways, that's all to say that Gilbert Hyatt really was influencing my approach. Now, this is not to make like everything after the 1960s sound like it was just horrible. But I think his approach works. And like the Caldecott stuff, I think this book is really a gem. So I'm hoping to have kind of a guided reading on this. And then we'll have a lot of interviews Like we're talking to people who are involved in education at the elementary, high school, even university level, who are sympathetic to some of the things.
Well, there's a sense in which what that vice principal is trying to do, it's the convoy mentality. It's like, if there's a really terrible teacher out there, maybe those suggestions will actually improve the classroom.
And I got an awful lot out of those suggestions.
Okay, good. But when you have if you've got somebody who's holding the kids' attention for 30-minute lectures, then by all means give 30-minute lectures. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But there is a corollary between what you're doing, the problem that you see in education that you're trying to address, and the problem that I see in social work.
Mm.
Okay? Because there's secular social work and Catholic social work, right? And the Catholic social work should be, in a sense, of a different quality, type, perspective than a secular social work, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's not happening. It's been homogenized into kind of more or less a secular social work. And just like there's established schools, there's established Catholic social work institutions, and they need reformed. They also needs to be refoundings, et cetera, right? And one of the things I've thought about is the need to, in a sense, have retreats or trainings for these places that maybe have hired a bunch of non-Catholics and things to help call them on. If even once a year you're forced to reframe what you're doing in a more supernatural context, right? You're forcing that person to have that reflection. You're telling them that that's, as an employer, what you value and what will be rewarded. And you're just kind of like trying to hopefully like create some change, right? And I have a friend who does this in Catholic education up in Omaha. His name's Keith Harone. He's got, I can't remember the name of his institute. It's called like the Evangelium Institute or something. But basically, he's doing retreats for Catholic school teachers, paid for by the Diocese of Omaha and by donors. And it's kind of a sense in which he does these education days where he's not just trying to indoctrinate them in Catholic catechism. He's trying to actually like call them on and give them a spiritual sense so that maybe they can go back to their schools. Do you see room for, I both believe in what my buddy's doing, and I believe that social workers need that. I have limited hope that will fix everything, and you're talking about creating curriculums, but if these curriculums are completely voluntary, where it's just like a couple of teachers, want to pay for this curriculum, you're not actually, you're helping some people, but you're not kind of like, like I doubt the non-Catholic teachers at the Catholic school are going to be, subscribing,
Yeah, no. And I always am reminding myself of the kind of limited impact this may have. The thing is that what we need to do is really to connect like good administrators with institutions that are putting out a certain type of teacher, because like faculty, right, is policy. We got to make sure that that principals know where to look to hire like people who are who know the subject very well. They just don't have the proper catechesis, but they also are very faithful. And so we need to make sure that these schools that want to move in this direction can find the right people. I don't think that you're going to change the hearts of the faculty members who already don't care much. The school that I taught at is still going through a little bit of a transformation. They're trying to have retreats like this to help open up a Catholic perspective on education. And I remember the first meeting that we had, it kind of really backfired because, they gave us a document that I knew was written by Pope Benedict on education. And it was like very much it was almost like a Regensburg address type of thing.
Right.
It wasn't the address itself, but it kind of had this like logocentric approach and leading with beauty. And I was all on fire about this. And they gave the mic to a bunch of teachers, and I grabbed the microphone, and I just went on and how I was so impressed by this document, and we should all be trying to, bring that to the classroom. And I was surprised, but a bunch of teachers actually accused me of being an absolutist and reminding me of the history and the violence of the church. And they equated all of this stuff with kind of indoctrination, and kind of behind it all, a certain form of violence. And so I saw that, oh, wow, that it's really hard to do this well. And this was a Catholic school. So I don't really have much hope for like, oh my gosh, Catholic education is going to completely change. But the little that we could do, and forming a network of those who want to really work towards this change, may lead to something that's really needed. Well,
that's great. Do you want to? What is the name of your blog, and how do people get to it?
Oh yeah, well, it's just robertmixa.com is my blog,
and Mixa is Mixa.
Yeah, but I'm also I also write things for Word on Fire. So on the website, just wordonfire.org, there's a lot of stuff there.
Great. Well, thank you, Robert.
No, thank you so much, Clark. I appreciated it. I really enjoyed my time.
Well, let's talk again soon.
Likewise.